I don't know if your successor has sought your counsel, but were he to call and ask you about this relationship, the U.S. relationship with China, what would you tell him? I remember hearing from you on that trip to Beijing about how frequently you were in contact with your counterparts there, and there was a lot of effort seemingly put into making that relationship stronger than it had been. What would you tell him worked well?
The relationship requires a lot of attention. I think that every relationship is based on personal interaction, but it is particularly important in China relationships. I think that establishing trust and candor is important. Doesn't mean you ignore hard issues. Your ability to press hard issues forward is increased when you have a relationship where there is that kind of confidence that you're basing your statements on facts and analysis, and you're telling your counterpart what you think. I believe that if you look at the U.S. strategic interest right now, the DPRK issue looms very large. The economic issues within that have to do with sanctions and cooperation between the United States and China on that. We made a lot of progress in the last year of the Obama administration, thanks to the outrageous actions of the government of North Korea. But we worked with China to get a UN Security Council resolution, and the importance of that is both the substance of the agreement, but also the process. China has a very strong view that sanctions should be multilateral, not unilateral. Having an international sanctions regime gives you the ability to press forward much harder than you could if it was just a unilateral action. In the last months of the administration, we pressed very hard, and China was taking actions that it hadn't taken in the past. I don't want to suggest there's not more they can do. There is more China can do. But pressing China to put its effort into having the government in Pyongyang realize that the pressure will get greater and greater is the only way that economic sanctions are going to have effect.
Talking with the former Treasury Secretary Jack Lew here exclusively on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio. Secretary Lew, I'm glad you bring up sanctions. It strikes me that over the course of your tenure, this was something that you relied on more than perhaps your predecessors did. You saw sanctions as a very powerful policy tool. How effective is that now that you look back on it out of office?
First, I think you have to look at the point in time. We were coming out of two wars that left the country quite war-weary, but we faced a world with substantial threats that we needed to respond to. And sanctions were available in a way that they had never been before because we had fine-tuned the way we do sanctions to have them be more highly engineered, more surgical, with less unintended consequence. I think in the case of Iran, they were very effective. In the case of Iran, there's no question but that the U.S. working with the global community to put extraordinary economic pressure on Tehran brought them to the bargaining table and produced an agreement that got Iran to back away from its nuclear program. That's the purpose of sanctions. When you accomplish your goal with sanctions, as I've said over and over again, you have to be willing to provide some relief from the sanctions. Otherwise, they're a useless tool. It can't be that you get the pressure until you act, and then after you act, the pressure stays in the same form. I think we did that in a very careful way, relieving the pressure we put on Iran for its nuclear program, but not relieving the sanctions that were related to its support of terrorism and other bad activities. I think that if you look at Ukraine, we work closely with Europe to put an enormous amount of economic pressure on Russia. Clearly, it hasn't broken the stalemate. The Minsk Accord is still kind of out there, not quite in force. But I do think it affected Russia's appetite for going further into Ukraine and for increasing the level of economic pain it would get. So even though it didn't lead to the ultimate goal, I think it had a tempering effect. The DPRK is really hard. The DPRK is not connected to the world in the way normal countries are, which is why the U.S.-China cooperation is so important. There aren't a lot of countries in the world that can put meaningful economic pressure on the DPRK. And that's why I think in the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and China, it's of paramount importance that that issue really take a high priority.